The thunder split the sky as Julia Kennedy stared out through the dirt-streaked window of the abandoned mining office. Outside, the town of Randsburg, California, was being lashed by rain so fierce it looked like silver ropes connecting heaven and earth. She had never expected to find herself here, trapped by a storm with her sister and a rugged stranger whose eyes seemed to match the wildness of the western frontier itself. "We're going to be stuck here all night," whispered Amanda, Julia's younger sister, her voice barely audible over the howling wind that rattled the wooden shutters. It was 1877, and the sisters had arrived in Randsburg just 3 days prior, having traveled from Boston following the death of their father. Their inheritance, a deed to a supposedly profitable silver mine, had brought them west with dreams of a new beginning. Instead, they found a failing operation, mounting debts, and now a storm that seemed determined to wash away what little hope they had left. Another crash of thunder shook the building, and Amanda clutched Julia's arm tighter. At 21, Amanda was 2 years younger than Julia, but in this moment she seemed like a frightened child. Julia wrapped her arm around her sister's shoulder, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "The roof's not going to hold if this keeps up," said the deep voice from the corner of the room. Blake Garrison stood with his back against the wall, his tall frame silhouetted by the occasional flash of lightning. They had met him only hours earlier when he had offered to guide them to their mining claim. When the storm hit, he had led them to this abandoned office building, the nearest shelter available. A loud crack sounded overhead, and water began to drip through the ceiling. The women clung to each other in fear as the building groaned against the force of the wind. Blake crossed the room in 3 long strides, his spurs jingling softly despite the cacophony of the storm. He knelt before them, his face level with theirs. In the dim light, Julia could see the determination in his eyes. "I'll stand between you and every storm," he said, his voice steady and sure. "This one and any that follow, you have my word." Julia didn't know why, but she believed him. There was something in his eyes, a steadiness, a promise that made her think he was a man who kept his word. "Why would you help us?" Amanda asked, her voice small. "You barely know us." Blake's lips curved slightly. "Out here, madam, people help each other. It's how we survive." Julia studied him in the flickering light of the oil lamp. He wore the dust of the trail like a second skin. His hands were calloused, his face weathered by sun and wind, but there was a gentleness to him that belied his rough exterior. "The storm's moving eastward," he continued, standing to peer out the window. "But we should stay put until morning. Try to get some rest if you can." Julia nodded, though sleep seemed impossible with the thunder still rumbling overhead and her mind racing with worries about their future. Their father's death had left them with few options. This mining claim was supposed to be their salvation. Now, it seemed like one more cruel joke in a year filled with hardships. Blake moved away from the window and shrugged off his duster. He laid it across the sisters like a blanket. "It's not much, but it'll keep you warm." "Thank you," Julia said softly, "for everything." He nodded once, then retreated to his position by the door, standing guard against both the storm and whatever other dangers the night might bring. Morning arrived with a sky washed clean of clouds, the brutal storm having moved on to torment other parts of the territory. Julia awoke to find Blake already outside, assessing the damage to the town. "There's a lot of cleanup to be done," he reported when they joined him. "But the road to your claim should be passable by midday." "Is that what you do, Mr. Garrison, guide people to their claims?" Julia asked as they walked through the mud-slicked streets of Randsburg. "Among other things," he replied. "I scout, hunt, track when needed." "Know this territory better than most." "You're not a miner?" Amanda inquired. Something dark flickered across his features. "I was, once." Julia sensed there was a story there, but she didn't press. Everyone in the West seemed to have a past they'd rather not discuss. Her father had taught her that much before he died. They reached the town's only hotel, a 2-story structure that had weathered the storm better than most buildings. "You ladies should get a proper breakfast. I'll arrange for transportation to your claim. You're still willing to take us?" Julia asked, surprised by his continued assistance. Blake's blue eyes held hers. I gave my word, didn't I? 3 hours later, they were in a wagon heading north out of Randsburg. Blake handled the reins with an easy confidence, navigating the rutted trail like someone who had traveled it countless times before. The landscape was unlike anything Julia had ever seen. Rocky outcroppings jutted from the earth like the spines of sleeping dragons. Scrub brush dotted the terrain, and in the distance, mountains rose purple against the sky. "It's beautiful in its own way," she said, breaking the silence. Blake glanced at her. "Most people only see the harshness, they miss the beauty." "Our father used to say that about life," Amanda chimed in, "that the difficult parts make the beautiful moments more precious." A ghost of a smile touched Blake's lips. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Julia said softly. "I just wish he had been more practical about certain things." "Like mining claims?" Blake asked. Julia nodded. "He purchased this claim based on a stranger's word and a few rock samples. We don't even know if it's viable." "Well, that's what we're going to find out." Blake slowed the wagon as they approached a fork in the trail. "Your claim should be about 2 miles up this path." As they turned onto the narrower trail, Julia felt a flutter of anxiety. This was it, their future depended on what they found at the end of this road. The cabin came into view first, a simple structure built of rough-hewn logs, its chimney standing like a sentinel against the sky. Beyond it, the dark mouth of a mine shaft opened into the hillside. "Home, sweet home," Amanda murmured, her tone making it clear she found it anything but sweet. Blake helped them down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at Julia's waist. She tried not to notice the way her heart quickened at his touch or how his eyes lingered on hers for just a moment longer than necessary. "The cabin looks sound," he observed, leading them toward it. "Might need some cleaning, but the structure's good." Inside, a layer of dust covered everything, but as Blake had said, the building was solid. A table, chairs, a small cookstove, and 2 narrow beds were the only furnishings. "It's quaint," Amanda said, trying to sound optimistic. Julia ran her finger along the table's surface, leaving a trail in the dust. "It's a start. We can make it comfortable." "I'll get your trunks," Blake offered, stepping back outside. When he returned with their belongings, Julia asked the question that had been on her mind since they'd arrived. "What do you know about this mine, Mr. Garrison?" He set the trunks down and straightened. "It was productive a few years back. The previous owner, a man named Harlow, pulled enough silver out to build himself a fine house in San Francisco. Then the vein seemed to dry up. And he sold it to our father," Julia finished. "For a considerable sum." Blake's expression turned grave. "Mining's a gamble, Miss Kennedy. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose." "And which do you think this is?" she pressed. He held her gaze. "I think that remains to be seen." "I'd like to take a look inside the mine, if you don't mind." "Now?" Amanda asked, glancing at the darkening sky. "Tomorrow," he said. "For now, let's get you ladies settled." Blake spent the remainder of the daylight hours chopping firewood, checking the perimeter of the property, and showing them how to operate the pump for the well. By the time darkness fell, they had a fire going in the cookstove and enough wood to last several days. "You don't have to stay," Julia told him as they shared a simple supper of beans and bacon that he had brought in his saddlebags. "We can manage. With all due respect, Miss Kennedy, you can't. Not yet." His tone was matter-of-fact rather than condescending. "This country doesn't forgive mistakes." "I'll camp outside tonight and take a look at the mine tomorrow. After that, I'll help you decide what your next move should be." "You mean whether we should cut our losses and go back east?" Amanda said bluntly. Blake shrugged. "That would be your decision. I'm just offering to give you the facts." "We appreciate that," Julia said. "Truly, but we can't afford to pay you much for your trouble." A shadow of amusement crossed his face. "I'm not asking for payment, Miss Kennedy." "Then why are you helping us?" she asked, genuinely curious. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the flame of the oil lamp between them. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be out of options in a hard land." The next morning, Julia awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of boots on the wooden floor. Blake had already built a fire in the stove and was preparing to head to the mine. "I thought I'd let you ladies sleep," he said when she emerged from the small bedroom she shared with Amanda. "You had a long journey yesterday." "I'm coming with you," Julia announced, reaching for her shawl. Blake's eyebrows rose. Into the mine, it's no place for a woman, she finished, her chin lifting. This mine is our property, Mr. Garrison. I intend to know exactly what we're dealing with. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough, but you'll need more than that shawl. It gets cold underground. An hour later, lantern in hand, Blake led Julia into the mouth of the mine. The timber supports creaked ominously overhead as they ventured deeper into the earth. Watch your step, he warned, his voice echoing slightly. The ground's uneven. Julia tried not to think about the thousands of tons of rock above her head, or the way the air grew thicker and harder to breathe the further they went. She focused instead on Blake's broad back ahead of her, on the confident way he navigated the narrow passageway. They reached a junction where the tunnel branched in two directions. Blake held up the lantern, examining the walls carefully. This is where they were following the vein, he explained, running his hand along a streak of darker rock. See this quartz line? That's where the silver was found. Julia moved closer, studying the wall. And it's gone now? Not necessarily. Blake moved further down the left-hand tunnel. Mining isn't just about finding a vein, it's about following it correctly. Sometimes miners miss where a vein branches or shifts. They continued deeper, with Blake occasionally stopping to examine the rock face or test the stability of the support beams. After nearly an hour, he led them back toward the entrance, pausing occasionally to take samples of rock. Daylight was a welcome relief when they finally emerged. Amanda was waiting anxiously outside, pacing in front of the cabin. Thank goodness, she exclaimed when she saw them. I was beginning to worry. We're fine, Julia assured her, though her legs felt wobbly after the tense exploration. Mr. Garrison was just giving me a tour of our investment. Blake set down his satchel of rock samples and wiped his hands on his trousers. The mine's in better shape than I expected. Supports are sound, no water issues. And the silver? Julia asked, unable to mask the hope in her voice. That's harder to say without a proper assay. He gestured to the samples. I'd need to take these into town, have them tested. How long would that take? Amanda asked. Few days, maybe a week. Blake looked between the sisters. The question is, can you ladies manage here while I'm gone? Julia straightened her shoulders. We'll be fine. I can handle a rifle, and Amanda is quite capable of keeping house. Blake seemed to consider this, his eyes taking in the isolated cabin and the wilderness surrounding it. I don't like leaving you unprotected. We're hardly helpless, Mr. Garrison, Julia insisted. Blake, he corrected. If we're going to be working together, you might as well use my given name. The familiar address sent an unexpected warmth through Julia. Blake, she repeated softly. His eyes held hers for a moment before he turned to survey the property once more. I'll leave tomorrow at first light. Should be back within 5 days, weather permitting. That evening, as they sat around the table eating a stew Blake had prepared from dried beef and vegetables, Amanda broached the subject they had been avoiding. What if the mine truly is worthless? She asked. What then? Blake set down his spoon. You have options. You could sell the claim for whatever you can get. There's always someone willing to take a gamble. Or you could work the land instead of the mine. This soil might support a small garden, maybe some chickens. We didn't come west to become farmers, Julia pointed out. No, but you came west to build a new life, Blake countered. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns. Is that what happened to you? Amanda asked boldly. An unexpected turn, Blake's expression closed like a door. Something like that. Julia shot her sister a warning look, but her own curiosity was piqued. You mentioned you were a miner once. What changed? For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the cabin walls. I had a claim up near Virginia City. Good one too, pulling out enough silver to make a man comfortable. Had a partner, Jack Thornton. We'd been working together since the end of the war. He paused, and Julia could sense the story darkening. One day, Jack went into town for supplies. Never came back. I found him 3 days later, shot in the back on the trail home, all our money gone. That's terrible, Amanda gasped. Blake nodded grimly. Found out later it was the work of the Blackwell gang, 3 brothers who'd been terrorizing mining camps up and down the territory. I tracked them for months. Did you find them? Julia asked softly. His eyes met hers, hard as flint. 2 of them, the third still out there somewhere. The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Julia realized she was looking at a man who had administered frontier justice with his own hands. It should have frightened her. Instead, she felt an odd sense of security knowing the depths of his determination. After that, I couldn't go back to mining, he continued, his voice softer now. Too many ghosts, so I started guiding, scouting, using what I know about the land to help others. And to keep searching for the third brother, Julia surmised. Blake didn't confirm or deny it, but his silence was answer enough. The next morning, before dawn had fully broken over the eastern mountains, Blake prepared to leave for Randsburg with the rock samples. He had spent part of the previous evening teaching Julia how to reload the Winchester rifle. He was leaving with them and reviewing basic safety precautions. "Keep the doors barred at night," he reminded her as he saddled his horse. "And don't go into the mine without me. Even if it seems safe, underground conditions can change quickly." "We'll be careful," she promised, handing him a small bundle of food for his journey. "And you? Will you be careful as well?" Something in her tone made him pause, his hands stilling on the saddle straps. He turned to face her, and in the golden light of dawn, his features seemed softer somehow. "I always am," he said, his voice low. "Got too many responsibilities now to be careless." The implication that she and Amanda were among those responsibilities sent a flutter through Julia's chest. She was not accustomed to depending on anyone since her father's death, yet Blake's steady presence had already become something she relied upon. 5 days, she said, taking a step back. "We'll expect you then." He nodded, mounting his horse with the fluid grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. "If I'm not back by sunset on the 5th day, bar the doors and windows. Don't open them for anyone but me." The seriousness of his warning sent a chill through her despite the morning warmth. "You're expecting trouble?" "I'm always expecting trouble, Miss Kennedy. That's how I've stayed alive this long." He tipped his hat to her. "Take care of yourself and your sister." She watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the vast landscape until he disappeared around a bend in the trail. Only then did she acknowledge the hollow feeling in her chest, as if something essential had gone with him. The first 3 days of Blake's absence passed uneventfully. Julia and Amanda fell into a routine, cleaning the cabin until it was as habitable as they could make it with their limited supplies. They explored the immediate area around the property, always keeping the cabin in sight as Blake had instructed. On the 4th day, they awoke to find dark clouds gathering on the horizon, the air heavy with the promise of rain. By midday, the wind had picked up, whistling around the corners of the cabin with an eerie moan. "Another storm," Amanda observed, looking anxiously out the window. "Do you think he'll still come back tomorrow?" "If he can," Julia replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Blake knows these lands. He won't take unnecessary risks." But as the day wore on and the storm grew closer, her confidence waned. By nightfall, rain was lashing against the cabin, and thunder rolled across the sky in waves that seemed to shake the very foundation of their shelter. "It's worse than the storm in town," Amanda said, huddled beside the stove for warmth. "What if he tried to return early and got caught in it?" Julia tried not to think of Blake out in this weather, possibly injured or lost. "He survived worse, I'm sure, and he knows to seek shelter." But her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The night passed slowly, with neither sister sleeping much as the storm raged on. By morning, the rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, but the skies remained dark and threatening. "It's the 5th day," Amanda noted as they shared a meager breakfast of hardtack and dried fruit. "Do you think he'll still come?" Julia glanced out the window at the muddy trail leading to their property. "If he can make it, he will." But as the hours passed and the day began to wane, there was no sign of Blake. Julia found herself making increasingly frequent trips to the window, straining her eyes for any movement on the horizon. When the sun began to set, Amanda voiced what they were both thinking. "He's not coming, is he?" "We don't know that," Julia insisted, though doubt had begun to gnaw at her. "He could be delayed by the storm, or the assay might be taking longer than expected. Or something could have happened to him," Amanda said softly. Julia couldn't bear to consider that possibility. In the short time they had known him, Blake had become their lifeline in this harsh new world. The thought of him lying injured or worse somewhere between Randsburg and their cabin was unbearable. We'll give him until full dark, she decided. Then we'll bar the doors as he instructed. The last light was fading from the sky when they heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching. Julia rushed to the window, her heart hammering in her chest. "It's him," she cried, recognizing the broad-shouldered silhouette even in the dimming light. Relief flooded through her so strongly that her knees felt weak. She hurried to the door, throwing it open just as Blake reached the cabin. He dismounted stiffly, his clothes still damp from the rain. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes brightened at the sight of her. "You're safe," he said, as if that had been his primary concern all along. "We are," she confirmed, stepping back to let him enter. "And you're late." A weary smile touched his lips. Trail was washed out in places, had to find another way around. Amanda had already moved to put the kettle on, sensing that Blake needed something warm after his journey. "Did you get the assay results?" she asked eagerly. Blake nodded, shrugging off his wet coat. "I did." There was something in his tone that made Julia's stomach tighten with apprehension. "And," she prompted, he reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a folded paper. "There's silver there, all right, not a lot, but enough to be worth mining if you're willing to put in the work." Julia took the paper, scanning the official-looking document. "It says the concentration is low but consistent." "What does that mean exactly?" Amanda asked, bringing Blake a cup of hot coffee. He took it gratefully, warming his hands around the mug. "It means you won't get rich overnight, but with steady work and a bit of luck, you could make a decent living. The vein runs deeper than the previous owner thought. He gave up too soon." Hope, cautious but real, blossomed in Julia's chest. "So we haven't inherited a worthless hole in the ground after all." "Far from it," Blake confirmed. "You've got something solid here, something you can build on." The relief that washed over the sisters was palpable. They had come west with nothing but a promise and a prayer. Now it seemed that promise might be fulfilled after all. As they shared a simple meal that evening, Blake outlined what would be needed to begin working the mine properly. Equipment, supplies, possibly hired help if they wanted to extract the silver at a faster rate. "It won't be easy," he warned. "Mining never is, but if you're determined, it can be done." "We are determined," Julia assured him. "More than you know." Later, after Amanda had retired to bed, Julia found herself alone with Blake by the dying embers of the fire. There were questions she wanted to ask, things she needed to know now that their future seemed more certain. "Will you stay?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "To help us get started, I mean." Blake was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the glowing coals. "I could," he said at last. "For a while at least. But not permanently," she surmised, trying to ignore the disappointment that settled in her chest. He turned to look at her then, his expression more open than she had yet seen it. "I don't know, Julia. I haven't thought that far ahead in a long time." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. "What is it that keeps you moving?" she asked. "Is it just the search for that third brother, or is there something else?" Blake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Partly that, partly habit, I suppose. After the war, after Jack's death, staying in one place began to feel like waiting for the next bad thing to happen. And now." His eyes met hers, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. "Now I'm starting to wonder if running means missing out on things worth staying for." The implications of his words hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Julia felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze. "I should turn in," she said softly, rising from her chair. "It's been a long day." Blake nodded, standing as well. "I'll be outside if you need anything." "You don't have to sleep outdoors," she protested. "We can make room, it's better this way," he interrupted gently. "For now." She understood his meaning propriety had to be maintained, especially in such close quarters. Still, the thought of him outside while they were comfortable inside didn't sit well with her. "Good night, then," she said, pausing at the door to the bedroom. "And Blake, I'm glad you came back safely." His smile was soft in the dim light. "So am I, Julia, so am I." The next few weeks passed in a flurry of activity as they began preparations to work the mine. Blake traveled back to Randsburg twice more. returning with supplies, tools, and on the second trip, two experienced miners willing to work for a share of the proceeds rather than wages. The men, brothers named Illy and Samuel Cooper, were quiet, hard-working individuals who had been mining various claims throughout the West for over a decade. They built themselves a small shelter near the mine entrance and set to work immediately, following Blake's guidance on where to continue the excavation. Julia found herself settling into a routine that, while exhausting, gave her a sense of purpose she had lacked since her father's death. She kept the books, managed supplies, and even ventured into the mine occasionally to see the progress firsthand. Amanda, initially less enthusiastic about their rustic new life, had discovered an unexpected talent for cooking on a wood stove and had begun experimenting with wild herbs she found growing nearby. The cabin, once barren and unwelcoming, was slowly transforming into a home. And through it all, Blake remained. He never explicitly stated that he was staying permanently, but each day that passed without mention of his departure felt like a small victory to Julia. Their relationship had evolved too in subtle ways. Conversations that once revolved entirely around the mine now meandered into personal territories. She learned about his childhood in Missouri, his service during the Civil War on the Union side, his dreams of someday owning a cattle ranch. In turn, she shared stories of her life in Boston, her education at a ladies' seminary, her close relationship with her father. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the rough-hewn bench Blake had built outside the cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, he surprised her with a question. "Do you ever regret coming west?" Julia considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted. "When it's been a particularly hard day or when I'm missing certain comforts from back east. But then I look at what we're building here, what we've accomplished already, and I know this is where I'm meant to be." Blake nodded, his profile strong against the fading light. "I used to think I'd never settle anywhere again, that I'd just keep moving until you found that third Blackwell brother," she finished when he trailed off. "Yes." He turned to face her, his expression troubled. "But lately, I've been thinking that's no way to live, always looking back, always hunting ghosts." Julia's heart quickened. "And what would be a better way?" His hand found hers on the bench between them, his calloused fingers entwining with her softer ones. "Building something. Creating instead of destroying, having someone to share it with." The implication of his words made her breath catch, but before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Blake was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Get inside," he ordered, all tenderness gone from his voice. Now, Julia obeyed without question, hurrying into the cabin where Amanda was preparing supper. "Someone's coming," she explained, moving to the window where she could see Blake standing tensely in front of the cabin. His stance wide and ready, 3 riders emerged from the gathering dusk, their features indistinct in the fading light. Blake remained motionless as they approached, only his eyes betraying his alertness as he tracked their movements. "Evening," called the lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache. "Hope we're not intruding." "Depends on your business," Blake replied, his tone neutral but wary. The man dismounted, followed by his companions. "Name's Marshall, Tom Marshall. These are my associates, Dawson and Fletcher. We represent the Western Mining Consortium." Blake didn't relax his stance. "Never heard of it." Marshall smiled thinly. "We're relatively new. Expanding our operations throughout the territory, buying up promising claims." Understanding dawned on Julia. They were here about the mine. "This claim's not for sale," Blake stated flatly. Marshall's smile didn't waver. "Perhaps the owners might feel differently." "We're prepared to make a very generous offer." "I said it's not for sale." Blake's hand remained near his gun. "Now, if you gentlemen have ridden all this way for nothing, that's unfortunate, but you'd best be on your way before dark." The atmosphere tensed, the air between the men seeming to crackle with unspoken threats. Julia held her breath, watching as Marshall's smile slowly faded. "At least let us speak with the owners," he insisted. "Seems only fair they hear our proposition directly." Before Blake could respond, Julia stepped out onto the porch. "I'm Julia Kennedy." My sister and I own this claim, and as Mr. Garrison has already told you, it's not for sale." Marshall turned his attention to her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Miss Kennedy, a pleasure. Perhaps you haven't been fully informed of the difficulties of mining in this region. The costs, the risks, the isolation." "I'm well aware," she replied evenly. "We've been working this claim successfully for weeks now. Even so, our offer would provide you with immediate funds." "No more waiting, no more uncertainty." Julia lifted her chin. "We're not interested in immediate gratification, Mr. Marshall. We're building something here, something lasting." Marshall's expression hardened. "I urge you to reconsider. The consortium is prepared to pay $3,000 for your claim. That's more than generous." "The answer is still no," Julia stated firmly. "Now, as Mr. Garrison suggested, you should be on your way before nightfall." For a tense moment, it seemed Marshall might argue further. Then he nodded curtly, remounting his horse. "Very well, but should you change your mind, we'll be in Randsburg for the next week." As the three men rode away, Blake moved to stand beside Julia on the porch. "You handled that well," he commented, his voice low. "They'll be back," she said, watching the retreating figures. Blake nodded grimly. "Yes, they will." His prediction proved accurate. 3 days later, Marshall returned alone, this time with a written offer and a more conciliatory approach. Again, Julia declined. The following week, it was Dawson who appeared, ostensibly just passing by to check if they had reconsidered. "They're persistent," Amanda observed after this third visit. "Do you think they know something about the mine that we don't?" "It's possible," Blake acknowledged. "But more likely they're just buying up as many claims as they can, operating on the principle that some will pay out big." "Well, they can keep looking elsewhere," Julia stated firmly. "This mine is our future." But their determination was tested later that month when Julia descended into the mine to bring the Cooper brothers some midday refreshment, only to find Illy in a panic. A support beam had cracked, and Samuel was trapped beneath a partial collapse of rock. The next hours were a blur of frantic activity as Blake and Illy worked tirelessly to free Samuel without causing a further cave-in. When they finally pulled him to safety, his leg was badly broken, and he had sustained numerous cuts and bruises. "He needs a doctor," Blake said grimly, examining the compound fracture. "I can set it temporarily, but he'll need proper medical attention." "Randsburg's too far with an injury like this," Illy protested. "He'd never make it." "There's a doctor in Garlock," Blake said, referring to a smaller settlement about 10 miles away. "I'll take him in the wagon." It was a risk leaving Julia and Amanda alone with Marshall and his men still in the area, but Samuel's condition left them no choice. Blake set the broken leg as best he could, loaded the injured man into the wagon, and prepared to depart. "Keep the rifle close," he instructed Julia as he checked the harness on the team, "and remember what I taught you about using it." "We'll be fine," she assured him, though her stomach knotted with anxiety at the thought of his absence. "Just hurry back." He hesitated, then surprised her by pulling her into a quick, fierce embrace. "I will," he promised, his breath warm against her hair. Julia watched the wagon disappear down the trail, Samuel's groans of pain fading with distance. Beside her, Amanda squeezed her hand. "He'll be back soon," her sister reassured her, "and Samuel will be all right." Julia nodded, though the unease persisted. "Let's get inside. There's plenty to keep us busy until they return." But Blake didn't return that night nor the next morning. By midday, both sisters were on edge, jumping at every sound from outside. "Something must have happened," Amanda fretted, pacing the cabin floor. "They should have been back by now." "The doctor might have wanted to keep Samuel overnight," Julia reasoned, though her own worry was mounting. "Or perhaps the wagon broke down. Or perhaps Mr. Marshall and his friends decided to eliminate the competition," Amanda suggested darkly. Julia shook her head. "They're businessmen, not murderers." "You don't know that," Amanda argued. "The West is full of stories about claim jumpers and the lengths they'll go to." Before Julia could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Both women froze, exchanging alarmed glances. "Blake would be in the wagon," Julia whispered, reaching for the rifle. They peered cautiously out the window to see Marshall and his 2 associates riding up to the cabin, along with 2 men they hadn't seen before. "Miss Kennedy," Marshall called out cheerfully, as if they were old friends. Might we have a word? Julia's grip tightened on the rifle. We have nothing to discuss, Mr. Marshall. Please leave our property. Marshall's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm afraid I must insist. We have some new information that might change your perspective on our offer. Whatever it is, we're not interested, Julia replied firmly. Now please go. Marshall dismounted, ignoring her request. Your friend Garrison had an unfortunate accident on the road to Garlock. Wagon wheel broke, I hear. He and the injured miner had to continue on foot, quite a setback. Julia's blood ran cold. How do you know about that? News travels fast in these parts, Marshall said smoothly. The point is, Miss Kennedy, you're in a vulnerable position, no protection, a damaged mine, injured workers. Surely you can see the wisdom in accepting our offer now. The threat in his words was thinly veiled. Julia raised the rifle, pointing it directly at Marshall's chest. I said leave. His expression hardened. You won't shoot us all, Miss Kennedy, and even if you managed to, how would you explain 5 dead men to the authorities? No, I think you'll find cooperation is your best option. Julia's finger hovered over the trigger, her resolve wavering in the face of his logic. Beside her, Amanda trembled visibly. What do you want? Julia asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The same as before, you're mine. Only now our offer is $1,500, not $3,000. Marshall smiled coldly. The price of stubbornness, I'm afraid. Julia knew they were trapped. With Blake gone and the Cooper brothers out of commission, they had no allies within miles. Even if she managed to hold off Marshall and his men today, they would simply return with more force later. I need to discuss this with my sister, she said, stalling for time. Marshall nodded magnanimously. Of course, you have 1 hour, we'll wait. As the men retreated to the shade of a nearby oak tree, Julia pulled Amanda into the bedroom for privacy. We can't sell, Amanda whispered frantically. This is all we have, I know, Julia agreed, but I don't see how we can fight them if Blake doesn't return soon. Maybe we could escape. Make our way to Garlock ourselves, Julia shook her head. They'd catch us before we got halfway there. The sisters debated their options in hushed tones, each suggestion seeming more desperate than the last. As their hour of grace neared its end, they were no closer to a solution. Time's up, ladies, Marshall called from outside. What's your decision? Julia took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. We need more time, she called back, until tomorrow at least. There was a pause, then the sound of boots on the porch. I'm afraid that's not acceptable, Marshall replied, his voice closer now. We need this resolved today. The door handle turned, but Julia had barred it after their earlier conversation. A thud followed as someone threw their weight against it. Open up, Miss Kennedy, Marshall demanded, his friendly facade abandoned. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Stay back, Julia warned, raising the rifle again. I will shoot. Another thud shook the door, the wood splintering around the bar. Amanda clutched Julia's arm, her face pale with terror. What do we do? She whispered. Julia steered her sister toward the back of the cabin. When they break in, run for the mine. Hide in the side tunnel we explored last week. What about you? I'll hold them off as long as I can, then follow you. The door shuddered under another impact, the bar beginning to splinter. Julia positioned herself with the rifle, determined to buy Amanda as much time as possible. With a final crash, the door gave way and Marshall burst in, followed by Dawson and Fletcher. Julia fired a warning shot that splintered the wood beside Marshall's head. Next one won't miss, she promised, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. Marshall raised his hands, but his expression remained confident. You're outnumbered, Miss Kennedy, and I doubt you've got more than 1 or 2 shots in you before your conscience stops you. Try me, Julia challenged, though she knew he was right. She had never shot a man and wasn't sure she could, even to protect herself and Amanda. The standoff stretched for several tense heartbeats, neither side willing to back down. Then, from outside, came the sound of galloping horses approaching at speed. Marshall's eyes flickered to the broken doorway, uncertainty crossing his features for the first time. Fletcher, see who that is, he ordered. But before Fletcher could move, a voice rang out from outside, a voice that sent a wave of relief crashing over Julia. Marshall, get out here now. It was Blake. Marshall's expression darkened. Garrison, seems your accident wasn't as serious as reported. There was no accident, Blake replied, stepping into view through the shattered doorway. His clothes were dusty from hard riding, but he stood tall and unwavering, his revolver trained on Marshall. Just another of your lies. Behind him, Julia could see several mounted men, including Sheriff Davis from Randsburg. Marshall's confidence visibly faltered. This is a private business matter, Garrison, nothing that concerns the law. Breaking and entering concerns me, Sheriff Davis said, dismounting and approaching the cabin. So does attempted claim jumping and threatening women at gunpoint. We did no such thing, Marshall protested. We were merely engaged in negotiations. Save it for the judge, Davis replied dryly. You and your men are coming with me back to Randsburg. As the sheriff and his deputies took Marshall and his associates into custody, Julia lowered the rifle, her arms suddenly weak with relief. Blake crossed to her immediately, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. Are you hurt? He demanded, his voice rough with concern. She shook her head. We're fine, just frightened. Without warning, he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart hammering against hers. I never should have left you alone, he murmured into her hair. You had no choice, she reminded him, allowing herself to melt into his embrace. How did you know to bring the sheriff? Blake released her, though he kept one hand at her waist as if unwilling to break contact completely. I didn't trust Marshall from the start. When we reached Garlock with Samuel, I sent a message to Sheriff Davis asking him to check on the consortium. Turns out they're not a legitimate operation at all, just Marshall and his gang of thieves who have been intimidating claim owners all over the territory. And Samuel? Amanda asked, emerging from where she had been hiding. The doctor says he'll recover, though he won't be mining again anytime soon. Blake's expression softened as he looked between the sisters. I rode back as fast as I could once I heard what Marshall was really up to. I'm just grateful I wasn't too late. So am I, Julia said softly, meeting his gaze. That evening, after the sheriff had taken Marshall and his men away and the cabin door had been temporarily repaired, Julia found Blake sitting alone on the porch, staring up at the star-filled sky. Penny for your thoughts, she said, settling beside him. He glanced at her with a small smile. Just thinking about how close I came to losing something precious today. The mine, she asked, though she suspected he meant something else entirely. Blake shook his head, turning to face her fully. No, Julia, not the mine, her breath caught at the intensity in his eyes. Blake, let me speak, he interrupted gently. I've spent years running from place to place, never allowing myself to form attachments. Even when I came here, I told myself it was temporary, that I'd help you and Amanda get established, then move on as always. He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. But something happened that I didn't expect. I found myself thinking about the future for the first time in years, imagining a life that involved more than just survival. What kind of life? Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. One with roots, a home, someone to share it with. His eyes held her steadily. When I rode back today and saw Marshall's men at the cabin, all I could think was that I might be too late, that I might lose you before I ever had the chance to tell you how I feel. Julia's heart soared. And how do you feel, Blake Garrison? Instead of answering with words, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, but when she responded by sliding her hands up to his shoulders, it deepened into something more passionate. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Does that answer your question? He asked, his voice husky. Julia smiled. I think I might need you to explain it again. He laughed softly, pulling her closer. I love you, Julia Kennedy. I think I've loved you since that first storm, when you looked at me with those brave eyes and tried to hide how scared you really were. I love you too, she whispered against his lips. Even when you were stubborn and mysterious and wouldn't tell me anything about yourself. I'll tell you everything now, he promised. No more secrets, no more running. If you'll have me, I want to stay, build a life here with you. Is that a proposal, Mr. Garrison? She asked, her eyes twinkling. He grinned, suddenly looking younger than she had ever seen him. Not yet. When I propose, you'll know it. I plan to do it properly. True to his word, 2 weeks later, after the mine had been secured and production had resumed with new workers, Blake took Julia on a ride to a beautiful overlook above the property. There, with the vast expanse of the West spread before them and the future bright with promise, he knelt and asked her to be his wife. Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the small church in Randsburg with Amanda as maid of honor and Lee Cooper, now recovered enough to walk with a cane, standing as Blake's best man. The entire town turned out to celebrate, having heard the story of how the Eastern ladies and their loyal cowboy had faced down claim jumpers and survived. In the years that followed, the Kennedy Garrison mine prospered, yielding enough silver to allow them to expand their operations and eventually build a proper house on the property. Amanda married a young lawyer who had come west to establish a practice in the growing town of Randsburg, and they built a home nearby, close enough for frequent visits. As for Blake, he never did find the third Blackwell brother. But as he often told Julia in the quiet evenings they spent on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard, he had found something far more valuable, a love worth staying for, and the courage to stand against any storm that life might bring. And on stormy nights, when thunder rolled across the sky and lightning illuminated the landscape, Julia would sometimes remember that first night in the abandoned mining office when two frightened women had clung to each other in fear, and a steady-eyed cowboy had promised, "I'll stand between you and every storm." It was a promise he had kept in ways neither of them could have imagined.